Well, good morning. This is a hearing on the Committee on Agriculture for Oversight of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Will come to order. I've asked Rick Crawford from Arkansas to open us with a prayer. Rick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Father, I bow humbly before you, thankful for every blessing of life, Lord, thankful for this country you've given us, and Father, mindful of the great responsibility that you've charged us with. Father, just ask that everything that's said and done here today be pleasing in your sight, and we'd ask that you help us to be civil in our discourse and discerning in our comments and dialogue. Father, I just pray it all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Rick. I want to thank the Secretary, Vilsack, for coming to be with us this morning. He has a hard stop at 12:15. He's got cabinet responsibilities to do. So, Mr. Secretary, thanks very much for being here this morning. Be careful on your knee there on the table. I want to welcome him. I want to say at the start of this, he and his staff have worked really hard to fulfill the multitude of committee requests for oversight information that we've flooded them with over the last 7 months, and I appreciate their cooperation and efforts to do that and work with our team on that. It's Congress's responsibility under the Constitution and explicit in House rules that each of the authorizing committees conduct oversight over the executive branch areas of their jurisdiction. The American people demand that we hold our government accountable for the responsible stewardship of our taxpayer dollars, holding us accountable as well. Now, today we'll examine the department through the lens of fraud, waste, abuse, as identified by the department's Inspector General, Phyllis Fong, and the Government Accountability Office, Congress's external audit organization. I'd like to say a few words about the Inspector Fong. She's served the department since 2002. Her office works hard in conducting hundreds of audits and investigations each year, all aimed at making the department more efficient. Her investigations, particularly on SNAP cases, ensure that those engaged in fraud do not prey on our most vulnerable. On behalf of the committee, I want to thank Inspector General Fong and her staff for working with the committee over the past 6 months. Oversight is essential to deterring waste, fraud, and abuse at federal departments and agencies. Government employees must remember that each time they awarded a grant or a contract, it's the taxpayers' money that they're spending. Today, we'll examine a few of the programs the department manages and executes. Over the course of our oversight efforts this year, we focused on the Farm Service Agency's MIDAS Information Technology Program and the Office of Advocacy and Outreach grants and cooperative agreements awarded 2010 and 2011. FSA intended for the MIDAS program to modernize its delivery of programs to farmers and ranchers. Unfortunately, it's been mismanaged, as evidenced by the fact that it spent $140 million over budget that only contains 2 of the 5 planned core functions. In July of 2014, Mr. Secretary, you signed a memorandum ceasing further development of MIDAS. GAO and IG agrees with that makes sense. This maintenance of MIDAS alone is costly. Today, we expect to hear about the path forward on the FSA's delivery of programs. IT management across government has deemed a high-risk area by GAO. The committee wants to see the Department of Agriculture implement the identified best practices and hold the responsible parties accountable. This committee will continue to monitor the work of both the USDA Chief Information Officer as well as the FSA's Chief Information Officer. We're also going to discuss today, as I mentioned, the Office of Advocacy and Outreach, the award of grants and cooperative agreements under that program. Between 2010 and 2011, that office, under the direction of then Assistant Secretary of Administration Pearlie S. Reed, awarded approximately $40 million in grants and cooperative agreements on a non-competitive basis. In essence, Mr. Secretary, he gave taxpayers' dollars away, and this is alarming. I know it's alarming to you as well. The Inspector General recommended that those responsible for these awards be held accountable. And I agree with that recommendation. Look forward to visiting with you this morning about the execution of that recommendation. Based on the public outcry that has occurred over other scandals involving the misuse or waste of taxpayer dollars, the American people want you to hold responsible those individuals accountable for egregious conduct that violates that trust. Mr. Secretary, thank you and your staff again for the cooperation. I look forward to your continuing working together on oversight. Thank you for being here, and I yield to the ranking member for any opening comments he has to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Secretary, back to the Ag Committee. Appreciate you being here. Oversight of USDA is a responsibility the committee takes very seriously, and having an open dialogue with the department is important, not just to ensure that USDA is operating in the best interests of our constituents, but implementing programs as Congress intended. A few areas that we are specifically looking at today include the operation of the Office of Outreach and Advocacy created by the 2008 Farm Bill, awarding strike force initiative and Section 2501 grants in 2010 and 2011, and a review of the Beginning Farmer initiative and the long-delayed development of MIDAS, the FSA computer system upgrade. Since the Secretary is joining us today, I wouldn't be surprised if members use this opportunity to address others that may be happening in their districts, such as the avian flu situation, which has impacted many of my poultry producers and others across the region. I've appreciated the department's efforts in this regard. Thus far, they've been doing a good job, and I'm looking forward to an update on the future plans within the department, their response if we have another outbreak that occurs this fall. So again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding today's hearing. USDA is a large department which can make adequate oversight a difficult task, and we might have different ideas about how to get there, but I think that we all want the department to be running effectively and efficiently as possible, and the Secretary has a big job. We had a discussion yesterday, and he was telling me that they do 7.5 billion transactions a year in the department. Am I right about that? Yeah, that's pretty astounding. So they're bound to have a couple of glitches here and there. So anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Secretary Vilsack, thank you again for being here. The microphone is yours, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and to the ranking member as well. Given the interest of time and the number of members who are going to participate in this committee meeting, Mr. Chairman, I wonder if I could defer my opening remarks and perhaps maybe use a bit of my time that I'm saving to extend an answer if that becomes necessary, so that everyone gets a chance to ask the questions that they need to ask.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate that. Thousands and thousands of great employees at your department get up every single day, go to work, try to do the very best they can for the taxpayers and beneficiaries they serve. But the actions of a few who violate that trust taint everybody. And so our conversation this morning will be about those few, as opposed to being able to brag on all the rest of the folks who really do a good job. And every organization has got those few bad apples that we've got to understand what happens to them, and the deterrence factor, and the fact that things should happen to folks who do breach the public trust. So let's talk a little bit about Pearlie Reed. I believe he was an undersecretary in charge of spending a lot of money. The special agents that conducted that investigation discovered, in addition to the $40 million in grants that appear to have been granted without competition, that Mr. Reed also was able to direct, either by himself or through some other folks, a relatively significant amount of money, $275,000+, to an individual in which he had a physical relationship with. Mr. Reed resigned, I guess, 2012. Did you ask for his resignation, or did he do that on his own?
Mr. Chairman, I became aware of concerns about Mr. Reed's handling of the incidents and the accounts that you've just addressed by virtue of a hotline tip that we received. Based on that tip, I asked immediately for the OIG to investigate. The OIG produced what is called a fast report, which indicated some concerns that they had, not a comprehensive report. I shared that report with Mr. Reed, indicated to him that obviously we were disappointed in what we had initially learned about this, and following that conversation, Mr. Reed left the employment of the USDA.
Well, thank you. I believe that the overall investigation led to a recommendation by the agency to refer to Justice Department. Can you visit with us about that, and why, if you know, why Justice chose not to pursue criminal actions?
Mr. Chairman, following Mr. Reed leaving the office, then the OIG continued its review of activities involving 2501 and strike force involving Mr. Reed. They took a good deal of time, obviously, to complete the report. When the report was completed, we basically requested the Department of Justice to take a look at this. I believe it was referred down to the Department of Justice in Arkansas, and the U.S. Attorney in Arkansas chose not to prosecute. I can't share with you today, because I don't know the specific reasons for why he chose not to prosecute. But that decision makes it difficult, if not impossible, for us to take any further action with reference to Mr. Reed because of the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically 180.2110 and 417.2110, that basically outlines processes that we could take if there is a criminal judgment or a civil judgment. Obviously, there is neither in this case. And so, as a result, we are where we are today. We focused our attention, frankly, Mr. Chairman, after we received the FAST report and after we received the full report, on fulfilling the recommendations that OIG outlined in terms of improvements to the programs, and I can tell you that today they are fundamentally different than they were in 2010, 2011.
All right. Those processes, could this individual be, what's the phrase, suspension or disbarment, so that, I understand as under the Bush administration, he was a consultant to the government. Can he be prevented from coming back under any kind of a contract?
Under the Code of Federal Regulations that I cited, Mr. Chairman, in order to take that action, that specific action, there has to be a criminal judgment or a civil judgment. In other words, a court of law has to make a determination that something inappropriate occurred. And based on that judgment and determination, you're then empowered under the Code of Federal Regulations to take steps. We don't have that in this particular circumstance.
Okay, well,
And Mr. Reed, to be fair to Mr. Reed, he did serve the NRCS in a capacity for a number of years of the federal government before he came back as the Assistant Secretary of Administration. And the reason I asked him to do that in 2009 was because our department had a very serious concern and problem with civil rights generally, which we wanted to aggressively address.
well, I appreciate that. I believe you mentioned that this came to your attention on a hotline tip, a whistleblower tip. Can you walk us through kind of the attitude at the agency or at the department toward whistleblowers and how the function is available to folks who see something going on that they disagree with?
Well, obviously, we encourage folks who are seeing activity that is inappropriate to notify us, notify their supervisor, notify people in charge of concerns that they may have. That's why we have the hotline process, to be able to do that in a way that doesn't necessarily compromise your ability and your relationship with other coworkers. And we take these things very seriously by virtue of the fact that when that hotline tip occurred, it came to my attention immediately, and my first action was to ask the Inspector General to look into it. You know, we're not, I've said to my folks, I'm not concerned about people making mistakes, but I want to know what they are, and I want to be able to fix them. If there's a problem, I want to know what it is, and I want to know it as soon as I can, because we are very interested in the job that we have, and I take very seriously what you said at the outset, which is that we have a responsibility to taxpayers to make sure that these resources are being spent appropriately, and it's unfortunate and disappointing when that doesn't occur.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Ranking Member, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, back when I was chairman, I had meetings with some of your computer people. I thought at the time, you know, they brought in a couple new people, that they were on track to get this thing straightened out, you know, but they were having funding challenges, and, you know, and as I understand, I think that there's been an uneven kind of deal going on with the funding of that. How much of that uneven funding and not being able to plan had to do with the problems that happened there in the Midas situation?
Well, Congressman, I would, you know, I was reading the good book the other day, and in Proverbs there's a couple of suggestions that a wise man measures his steps, and a wise man has many counselors. With reference to Midas, we didn't measure our steps, and we didn't have as many counselors as we needed, frankly. When this thing was started in 2007, 2008, I think the vision was pretty grand, but I don't think people fully appreciated the difficulty of basically implementing that in the context of a 1980 system, which is what we basically have at FSA offices. This is a huge undertaking. It involves 11 million customers, 5 million farmers, 8.1 million farms, and 38 million tracts of land. So it's a huge undertaking. And frankly, we didn't have at the outset what we have today, which is a process of review and many hands and many eyes basically watching this and doing this in an incremental way. So budgeting was an issue, there's no question about that, but also the way in which it was originally structured and the way in which we failed to recognize that there was a different vision in Kansas City where some of this work was going to be done, and a different vision in D.C. And as a result of that conflict, things didn't get set up as they should have. We have made progress, and we do have some benefit from Midas today. A farmer can walk into an FSA office today in any county in the country and facilitate and see all of the records regardless of where that land might be located. That was not the case before. He had to go to individual offices if he had land in different counties. We also have installed our business integrity efforts, which will allow us to reduce errors and mistakes. And we're now working collaboratively with NRCS on their Gateway program to take the next step, which is to allow folks to be able to do a lot of the work that they want to do at home without the necessity of even coming into an office. So progress has been made, but it clearly wasn't implemented in the way that I think people envisioned at the beginning. And we have addressed those issues by establishing a process within the CIO's office for review, a more functioning e-board, and weekly and now bi-weekly reports to me directly about the status of Midas, about the status of the Gateway program, and about the status of accuracy, which is the next step.
Have we gotten rid of the AS400s and System 36s? Are they gone?
Well, I don't think that they're totally gone, and that's one of the complications. It's essentially we've sort of meshed and merged systems, which may explain why we're going to have to continue from time to time to patch and to put resources into the system. This gets back to this different vision and different focus between the folks in Kansas City and the folks in D.C.,
All right.
which we have addressed.
Thank you. As you know, first of all, I want to thank you and the department, Dr. Clifford, for the work that you have done and continue to do, helping us with our avian influenza situation, which hits my district probably harder than anybody. And, you know, there's concerns out there, and you've been, I think, pretty good in addressing those as they come along. And, you know, it wasn't a perfect situation, but whenever you get in a crisis, you know, it's not going to be perfect. But one of the concerns I'm hearing now is these inconsistencies in indemnity payments that, you know, we appreciate what you're doing, and I think you've been doing it out of the CCC, and the OMB has been supporting you, and so that seems to be working. But apparently, there are different indemnity payments for high-path avian influenza versus low-path avian influenza, and this, I guess, goes back to when we did legislation back when we had the low-path in Virginia, I guess. So under the regulations, apparently egg layers are compensated for future egg production according to the low-path regulations, but the high-path regulations are silent in that aspect. And so the turkey folks, you know, are wondering, you know, why they're not compensated for what would be the full cost of the bird, kind of similar to what is happening with the egg production under the low path. And are you looking at that? Is there a way to bring constancy to that situation?
The quick answer is we are looking at it. We recognize that there is a difference between low path and high path, and there ought not to be. We also are taking a look at whether or not we could create some kind of more uniform system that would be based on the size of the operation in terms of cleaning and upkeep expense as well, because there is obviously some confusion about precisely who gets paid to do what relative to disinfection and cleaning. This is a process that I think we are looking at, and we are hopeful that we get this thing in a better place and a more consistent place before the fall. It's why we have set up a task force, which I instructed be set up to look at ways in which we could be better prepared if this thing reemerges in the fall.
Well, thank you, and again, thank you and the department for the work that you've done.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Lucas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, I have to echo the comments of the chairman and the ranking member about the challenges that you and the department have faced in implementing a rather dramatic change in policy in the 2014 Agricultural Act. Really, I think in most areas it's been quite fundamentally amazing how successful that has been. But like anything, I have a few questions, Secretary, in a number of areas. One of the things I'm curious about, the $100 million that was provided for the implementation of Title I to be used for filling staff positions due to the increased workload from ARC and PLC. How much of that money was used? And if you could, perhaps in a follow-up if necessary, but provide the committee with a written breakdown of how that money was spent? Can you touch on that, Mr. Secretary?
I can, Mr., well,
Because, by the way, your county office folks have worked very diligently to get all this done. They're good people, but they face some challenges out there.
there's so many chairs and former chairs on this committee, I'm probably going to
Exactly.
Congressman, we are using this resource in a planned and strategic way, the $100 million. We didn't use it all at once. We have been basically ramping up as work requirements are required and facilitated. I can't tell you today the exact amount that has been allocated, but I can tell you that staff and temporary staff have been hired in offices, and that we are in the process of trying to determine where best to locate additional staff based on workloads. We will provide you with a breakdown, as you've requested, in terms of where the money has been spent and what we've purchased with it as soon as this hearing is over.
I very much appreciate that, Secretary. It's one of the things that I and a number of members of this committee promised those folks out in the field when they were going through the challenges of implementing this, was that there would be help, and we attempted in the Farm Bill. Since normally staff funding issues are handled by the Appropriations Committee, as you well know, not by the Authorizing Committee.
I would point out that overall, USDA staff is down by somewhere in excess of 10,000 FTEs since I became Secretary, and FSA has been disproportionately, and rural development have been disproportionately hit with those reductions.
Absolutely, and that just shows how much more effort the folks in the field are shouldering. That said, Mr. Secretary, I've also visited with you and a number of the other officials about a slightly different area, the way in which it appears that USDA is implementing a program that has a net effect of penalizing growers who plant cover crops. For producers who certified acreage planted to cover crops in generic base, particularly in 14 and 15 crop cycles, the question I keep getting from them is why can't you have used your discretion to allow those crops to be eligible for ARC and PLC?
Congressman, I think that the concern we have is the way in which the statute or the bill was crafted in terms of the flexibility that we have or don't have. Be happy to continue to work with you on this. We are encouraging cover crop production. We've seen a 350% increase in cover crop. We understand the importance of it. I think there may be a concern about whether or not we actually have the legal authority to do what you're asking us to do. But if you have a interesting way for us to get around that, we'd be more than happy to hear it. Thank
you, Mr. Secretary. And one last question. I assume probably my colleagues will have some questions about the accuracy program, ARCSI. In 2014 Farm Bill, the USDA was instructed to inform the committee when it had reached substantial completion of the accuracy program, and the report that was submitted to the committee in July indicates that so far the program is a pilot in place in about 30 counties in Illinois and Iowa. That's an interesting substantial completion report. You see the perspective that I offer up.
Well, the reason for this, Congressman, is that we learned lessons from the initial implementation of MIDAS, which is that we instituted the whole program, or tried to institute the whole program, and found that we had serious glitches and unintended consequences through the computer process. So what we have decided to do in the future is to stage implementation so that we work out the bugs in advance before we basically create a lot of havoc and concern and confusion in the countryside. The states were chosen in part because folks volunteered and were willing to participate. They were also chosen in part because of the bulk of work that's done in corn and soybean production. No disrespect to the good folks in Oklahoma, but Congressman King does have a lot of power in this committee, Mr.
He has a lot of influence everywhere. Again, Mr. Secretary, thank you for the efforts of implementing, and there are a few things that still need to be done, and I'm sure together we'll get it done. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Waltz for 5 minutes. Tim?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here, and I too want to echo my thanks to you and your team and the folks at the Minnesota Department of Ag on the avian influenza. Devastating to my district. It came hard, it came hot, it was big, and to try and get a handle on it. And now some of the lessons learned maybe, and Mr. Peterson hit on this a little bit, I'm just curious, we look at this, this turned out to be really labor intensive. Takes a lot of people to do this, and my two-part question on this is making sure you have the resources moving forward on this, and some of the suggestions coming out of the industry is that you have a kind of a first responder team that's ready to drop in and start spinning people up quicker so when this comes again, and I think unfortunately that will probably be the case, are we ready for it? So just those two parts.
APHIS employment is down by 800, about roughly 8,000 folks work for APHIS. We've had to hire 3,200 people to supplement the work of APHIS in terms of this avian influenza. 21 states have been impacted. What we have learned is we do need a command structure and a communication structure that is organized and in place as quickly as possible. A structure that reflects the need for regional communication, a structure that involves state communication, and a structure that involves county-by-county communication. So we are, as part of our planning process for the fall, we're looking at ways in which we can essentially identify assets and increase the number of incident command teams that would be available to go once this thing hits. We are planning for a circumstance where we're simultaneously having to deal with 500 outbreaks. We think that's sort of a worst-case scenario situation, so we're planning for that. We've had a meeting, a workshop last week. We have a meeting scheduled in Iowa next week with the industry to continue to listen and to learn.
Great.
And I think we are, we understand there are issues involving biosecurity, there are issues involving depopulation, there are issues involving disposal, there are issues involving indemnification, and the time for repopulation. So these are all issues that we want to learn and try to be in a better position. We also want to make sure that we pre-position and have as much work done as possible in terms of disposal sites. We ran into some issues with local officials on landfills, so we're looking at places where this could potentially crop up where it hasn't, trying to figure out if there are ways in which we can identify landfills, work already with local and state officials to get them prepared for this if it occurs, so that we streamline the process and don't have quite the delay that we've experienced in some other states.
Well, I'm certainly glad to hear that, and please take back to your folks, from the folks in the industry and the folks on the ground, they're appreciative of the work you did, and I would like to extend a thanks to my colleagues, Mr. Peterson and King, who have been leading on making sure we get this right and preparing for the future. A question on beginning farmer and rancher. Mr. Fortenberry, myself, Mr. Gibson authored that over here, and Senator Harkin on the other side, and much of those ideas came from things that you had done, Mr. Secretary, and told us about the need to build for the capacity for the future. The OIG came out with a few things on that. I think the one that probably was most troubling to me was, I've never questioned your commitment to this program. You've made it very clear, but the OIG says there were many agency officials that didn't understand that this was a priority, and that troubles me in terms of implementation and some of the things that came out about tracking and how many people are we getting involved, because I believe in this program. I know you believe in it. Where are we moving forward to make sure they get it, that you've made it a priority?
As a result of that report and as a result of the concerns that we have about beginning farmers and ranchers, the Deputy Secretary has been tasked with putting together a major effort to do better outreach, better communication within USDA and outside of USDA. She's done, I can't tell you how many roundtables and visits with a variety of interest groups, and we're working more collaboratively in a more integrated fashion than we did before. And we're also calling upon our land-grant universities to help us and assist us. A recent example involves Florida and A&M, where we basically shut down an ARS lab as part of a budget situation. A substantial amount of land became available, and one of the requirements for Florida and A&M to get that land was that they would actually use it as a beginning farmer and rancher hub. Use the land to basically make it easier for beginning farmers and ranchers. We're also working with the Defense Department. We noticed that there are a lot of folks leaving the military that are interested in potentially getting into farming. What we did notice was that the military didn't allow information about our USDA programs during the process of when folks leave the military. They're given information. We're now going to make sure that all of our information is available at each one of the bases, and we'll be making physical presentations to retired military or soon-to-be-retired military personnel as well. So I think it's in a much better place and a much different place than it was 6 months ago, a year ago.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Jim yields back. Austin Scott, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Vilsack, thanks for being here. A couple of quick things. Mr. Peterson mentioned issues with regard to the turkey farmers. Obviously, in Georgia, we have a tremendous amount of poultry farmers, and I guess one of the concerns that's been expressed to us is that in most cases, those farmers don't actually own the chickens. And so with regard to any type of insurance product, would there be a product for the actual growers that they could take advantage of if the flu worked its way into?
There isn't an insurance program. That was suggested and proposed in the 2014 Farm Bill, but I think because of budget concerns, it was not put in the Farm Bill. I would strongly urge the Congress, as it begins the process of considering future farm bills, to look for a way in which that issue can be addressed, because you've pointed an inequity in the situation. You know, we've paid out nearly 600,000 checks to livestock producers for a variety of disasters that they've experienced, and rightfully so. It feels different for these poultry producers because it is. So there's unfortunately not an insurance program. We're looking at ways in which we can look at this indemnification process through CCC that could potentially be based on a per square foot basis for the folks who own the facility, but not the chickens. We're looking at a variety of different ways, but there's not an insurance program today.
All right. I would appreciate if you would keep us informed on that. That is a very big deal for Georgia, as well as the cover crops that the former chairman mentioned. I want to talk a little bit about the Natural Resources Conservation Services and the new wetland identification process, if we could. Last week, they announced a new wetland identification process for the Prairie Pothole region. Can you explain how that's different from the current process?
Part of what we're attempting to do is to have a quicker determination than in the past. We've had a serious issue with backlog of activities, particularly in the Dakotas, where this is an issue, and we're trying to find a process to streamline the process so that we can get information to folks quicker and simpler and easier. I can provide more detail to you in your office on that, Congressman. We'd be glad to do that after this hearing.
All right, well, thank you. Well, I mean, I guess one of our primary concerns is with the EPA and waters of the U.S. and those rules, and when you see that coupled with potential changes of process, if
this is not connected in relationship to waters of the U.S. This is basically an understanding that there are a couple of areas in this country that have unique geographic challenges relative to conservation, and we want to be in a position to be able to respond to those challenges appropriately.
But it is a wetland identification process.
Yes.
Can you discuss the role of the Climate Change Program Office, the CCPO? I mean, how does that interact with other USDA agencies, and what are their current activities?
I hope I understand your question. Within USDA, we have a focus on climate, and we have a series of climate hubs that are regionally placed. Their responsibility is primarily to assess the vulnerabilities from changing climate and weather variability, and then provide a series of suggestions, new technologies, new techniques, new strategies for allowing producers in each region of the country to be able to adapt and mitigate to a changing climate. They are currently in the process of issuing those assessments. The Midwest section, I think the Northwest section, have completed their assessments. They're also doing additional outreach to producers so that producers have the latest information. We have a series of tools now available, technology tools that producers can use to allow them to better analyze precisely what they need to do. It's also, I think, designed to allow us to continue to work with producers to reduce greenhouse gases that are linked, emissions that are linked to agriculture. We think there are ways in which we can help producers do that and help the bottom line. And finally, it's, I think, a complement to precision agriculture that is taking over production agriculture. Each acre of land is different, and we want folks to be able to know precisely what to do on each acre relative to inputs.
Thank you for your testimony, and you know, the cover crops issue and the issue for the poultry farmers is certainly important to us, and hope you'll continue to work on that.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Fudge, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. Mr. Secretary, last week, this committee heard from 1890 land-grant institutions on a number of issues, including state matching requirements for certain research and extension grants. We heard from a number of them that they are not getting the funding for which they are eligible because their states are failing to meet the one-to-one match requirement. In fact, according to an APLU report, from 2010 to 2012, 61% of 1890 land-grant institutions did not receive 100% of the one-on-one matching funds from their respective states for extension and research funding. This lack of state matching funds resulted in a loss of almost $57 million to 1890s. What actions, if any, is USDA taking to address this?
Well, the first thing we're doing, Congresswoman, is trying to make sure that people understand precisely what is and isn't the rule relative to matching and what power the USDA has potentially in waiving the matching requirement. The 50% match requirement, I think the misunderstanding is that it has to come from the state. It doesn't necessarily have to come from the state. It can come from other sources. And I think that's part of what we need to get information out to the 1890s to make sure they understand that there are other options relative to those matching requirements. And then on a case-by-case basis to determine whether or not a waiver is appropriate, which we do from time to time. So I think if people understood that there's a multitude of ways in which that match can be reached, then that might alleviate some of the concerns and might open up some of the additional resources. The other thing we're attempting to do is we asked the 1890s to put together, in light of the 125th anniversary of the Morrill Act creating them, what do they see the future? They came back with a set of recommendations relative to the development of centers, which would integrate and allow the 1890s to work collaboratively together. We have been quite supportive. We put resources together. We've made commitments to help create those centers. So there's a lot of good positive activity taking place.
Well, good, because one of the things that I wanted to say to you is that I have to thank my colleagues, Mr. Davis and just recently Mr. Scott, for wanting to work with us on assisting you in making sure that these inequities are fleshed out. So you will be hearing from us. My second question is about HFFI. You know that it was authorized as a part of the Farm Bill to build off existing efforts and allow for communities across the country to improve healthy food access, foster local economies, and enhance public health. Now, recognizing the uncertainty of appropriations for HFFI in FY16, please give me some update on how USDA plans to implement it.
Well, I want to make sure that I understand the question. There are two efforts underway in terms of providing access and information for local and regional food systems that can meet people that are in need. One is an ongoing effort under the Healthy Finance Food Insecurity Initiative, $100 million, which was allocated. Roughly $30 million of that has already been directed to a variety of projects around the country. So that is being implemented and will be implemented over the next couple of years. The second issue is whether or not we can provide funding for the development of grocery stores and things of that nature. That has been less successful in terms of getting an appropriation generally from Congress, but we continue to work with our local and regional food efforts, our Farmers Market Promotion Program, our local and food and regional promotion programs to try to provide assistance and help.
Good, yeah, because the stores is a big issue, of course, in food deserts, so I appreciate that. I have no other questions. If there's something else you'd like to add, I have about a minute left. You're free to use it.
Well, I would say that it is appropriate on the 125th anniversary of the 1890s to focus on the fact that they have tremendous opportunity. And one of the things that we're doing with the 1890s is, in collaboration with them, is agribusiness is coming to us expressing concerns about the diversity of their workforce. And so the Deputy Secretary this fall will be working with a number of major agribusinesses to create some kind of job fair or work fair which would introduce those businesses to some of the bright students of the 1890s. So there is a lot of activity going on to try to connect folks in the agribusiness world as well.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Crawford, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you being here today. I have concerns about the actively engaged rules, and I know the department released draft rules on the implementation. of those provisions in the 2014 Farm Bill, setting limits on the number of managers allowed per farm was at your discretion, and I have some concerns that there are some farmers who will be unnecessarily penalized by this. How did USDA arrive at this number of allowed managers, and can you be sure that farms that are genuinely complex or with legitimate business interests held by many individuals are not negatively impacted?
Congressman, good question. This was designed to respond to some of the concerns that have been expressed about folks who were not farmers, who weren't connected to the land, receiving assistance and benefits. So we tasked the team to take a look at, and I would point out that in crafting the Farm Bill, Congress basically ensured that we walked down a fairly narrow lane here. Roughly 90 to 95% of the people who farm are not impacted by what we're talking about here. Primarily, this is limited partnerships. It doesn't affect corporations. It doesn't affect family farming operations. So it's a very limited universe of folks who could potentially be impacted, and it's the universe that created the concern to begin with folks in Manhattan and high-rises getting, being on a conference call and getting subsidies. So tasked the team to take a look at trying to close that loophole, then recognizing that closing loophole would be helped by having a bright line. How many people does it actually take? And how do you determine? So you start with the proposition that there ought to be one manager, but then you recognize that particularly in the South, there are operations that are large in size that require actually more than one person. So we created an option for those large operations to be able to make the case for additional managers, up to 2 additional managers, and we basically created some framework, some bright lines that will allow people to understand precisely how they could qualify and how they couldn't qualify for those additional managers. So there is a process where the default position is one manager, one set of subsidies, but if you can prove that you've got a complex and significantly large operation, you can basically go to 2 or 3 additional, 1 or 2 additional managers for a total of 3. But again, it impacts a very, very narrow framework. It does not impact family farming operations. It does not impact corporations because of the law.
Okay, I appreciate the bright line. I think that'd be very helpful if that bright line were as bright as possible to help allay any kind of concerns that, particularly as you mentioned in the southern region where we have economies of scale to a larger degree. You mentioned in your testimony that the Midas platform is currently being used to help manage records for about 11 million FSA customers. Can you tell us if other agencies like the NRCS have access to these records to facilitate the work they're doing for producers?
We are in the process of working with the NRCS, and the quick answer to your question is yes, but it also works the other way, in which FSA is working with the NRCS to utilize the gateway technology system and process that NRCS has developed to allow for that producer today to be able to access records and to look at contracts, to look at payment history, et cetera, from their home as opposed to going to an office, which was the case before. We obviously want to then piggyback the FSA aspect to provide that same kind of flexibility in the future. So we will be using and trying to figure out how to merge those efforts so that we provide greater convenience to customers, to producers.
I want to jump into the ACRSI, or Accuracy, Acreage Crop Reporting and Streamlining Initiative. The report received by the committee on the accomplishments of accuracy listed a number of key outstanding efforts that haven't been completed yet. I certainly understand that there are complex systems that involve large amounts of data, but what can you tell us on how those outstanding issues for integrating systems across FSA, RMA, and AIPs are being addressed, and what's the timeline for completion?
The next big step in that process is this summer, where we'll be basically taking a look at whether or not which contractor, which provider can provide us the best opportunity to take the next step based on the pilots that have been taking place in Illinois and Iowa, which have been extended. We're learning lessons, and we're going to be determining how to best integrate this system on top of the system that's been the foundation that was laid with Midas investment. So this summer we'll be making that determination and review, and then from that point on we'll begin to ramp up the number of people who are involved in the system to eventually get to a nationwide effort. I'd like to be able to tell you a specific date. The problem is I don't know what problems are going to crop up in that ramp-up process. I think this is a much better way to do it than in the past. So it may take a little bit longer in the front end, but it should have less inconvenience and confusion at the back end, and it should be better for producers at the end of the day. We're going to work on this in a very thoughtful, systematic way, which is going to be making progress as we go along. We're not delaying this. We want to do it right.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Kirkpatrick, for 5 minutes.
Nice to see you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. I'm going to ask you about 2 projects in my district that you're involved with that are very important to our economic development. The first is Fry. Campbell Global has left the project, and I'd just like to know what effect that has had on the progress of Fry, and where does the progress of Fry stand today?
Well, the record of decision for the Forest Service was signed, Congresswoman, in April of this year. This decision basically covers roughly 1 million acres, includes 430,000 acres of mechanically treated area and prescribed burn area. The stewardship contract, Phase 1 stewardship contract, was issued to Good Earth Power. They have 19 task orders covering roughly 32,400 acres, of which 4,200 acres has already been harvested. So that work is proceeding. Chief Tidwell recently visited the Fry area and will certainly understands it's a priority for you, but you need to know it's also a priority for us, because it is essentially the way of the future, and we have been using Fry as an example of better collaboration in other parts of the country to try to get folks to understand how to streamline this process. We're going to continue to work with diverse interest groups to make sure that this thing is implemented in a timely way.
Is there a Plan B in case Good Earth can't fulfill the task orders? In other words, will other contracts be let so that we can actually meet what needs to be cleared?
There are other forests within Fry that are being prepared, and I can, let me check with you, let me have my office check with you in terms of what Plan B is.
Okay.
As I sit here today, I don't know what Plan B is, because we're hopeful Plan A works, but if it doesn't, we obviously will look for additional contractors who are interested and able to do the work. This is part of the challenge. Folks say, they want more timber harvested, and in fact, this administration has harvested more timber, and we continue every year to ramp up the number of board feet that we're treating, but it requires resources, and I don't want to get into fire suppression, but that's a problem in terms of budgeting.
Well, I appreciate your interest in the project. You actually came out to Arizona and looked at our forests, and it is a model for a collaborative effort on forest health and bringing back the timber industry. My second question is about the Apache Railroad. It's a critical economic asset for Navajo County and the town of Snowflake. In my district, the railroad itself provides good jobs. It's very important to my pork producers, the timber operations, and potash mining. Can you tell me what the status is of the Little Colorado Water Conservation District's application for a community facilities loan for the purchase of the Apache Railroad?
What I can tell you, Congresswoman, is we need your help. We need your
Okay.
help to encourage folks to complete the application and to provide us a full and complete application. What was submitted was incomplete. We've notified them of that fact, and we're awaiting a response to our request for additional information. So anything
Okay.
you could do to help us get that additional information would be
We'll do that. Your time is of the essence, and it's a really important project, so we'll certainly work with your office. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Desjardins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Vilsack, I know that no trip to the Ag Committee would be complete without a lively discussion about black vultures. So, right. We're continuing to have problems in Tennessee, and Charlie Horde brought this to our attention from the Tennessee cattlemen. Excuse me. I think we've talked about this now 2 or 3 times. There is a provision in the Farm Bill Livestock Indemnity Program where producers are eligible for compensation for losses against protected species like black vultures. But what's been happening is that after they have these losses, the farm service agencies are telling farmers that they need someone from federal agencies to come out and verify the losses. However, APHIS is telling farmers that they're not able to go verify these losses. So there appears to be some kind of a miscommunication, and I wanted to make you aware that we're still having problems with that. Do you know of any action that's been taken to address this?
Congressman, the honest answer is I don't, but it seems you asking the question will prompt me to go back to the office and figure out if there is a third way to get this done. I understand APHIS is strapped, and that may be the reason, but that's not a particularly good reason for your producers, so let me see what we can do.
One suggestion has been made that state extension services be able to do that, or possibly even veterinarians be able to certify the losses. Is that something we could maybe entertain?
You know, that's a good point, Congressman, and it's something we try to impress upon our folks at USDA, that if you can't get the job done for whatever good reason, valid reason exists, then the next best thing is to figure out a way in which somebody else potentially could do it. And we obviously haven't done as good a job on that in this particular circumstance as we could. We'll work on it.
Okay, I would just touch on one other thing on that issue, that many of the farmers and ranchers have voiced concerns about the process of submitting the application, that it just takes too long to ultimately deal with the problem. The only method currently for submitting an application is via the mail, snail mail, and some of the claims processes take 4 to 6 weeks, and a lot of times capping season is over. And so maybe we could also look at a more efficient permitting process, perhaps something online, and then perhaps something for more than a year.
We have a process improvement effort at USDA where I've tasked each mission area to identify 2 major process improvement projects that they work on in order to reduce time inconvenience to producers. We've had pretty good success. We've saved over 100,000 hours of time as a result of this. But this sounds like a good opportunity for us to maybe suggest to APHIS that this could be a process improvement initiative.
Sure, and certainly my office is willing to do a lot of the legwork on this. If you can have someone follow up with our office on this issue, we'd be happy to work with you and help get it resolved. And thank you for indulging me for the 3rd time on this issue.
Well, I apologize you had to bring it up a 3rd time.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Graham for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Appreciate you being in my district for Florida A&M's commencement last May. Wonderfully received and much appreciated.
Thank you.
While you were there, you had an opportunity to go to Gadsden County, and I know that you met with farmers and local area leaders. During that time there, you spoke about the ways that the Department of Agriculture can assist in low-income, high-poverty rural communities. You mentioned the 1890s agribusiness partnerships. Curious if that's what you were referring to during that time, or if you could elaborate more on that. Thank you.
Congressman, I appreciate the question. It's part of, but not by any means all what we're trying to do. And with your permission and the chair's permission, I'm going to elaborate on this just a bit. When I came into office, one of the first suggestions that was made to me was that there were literally tens of thousands of claims against the department for discrimination in the past, and there was an effort to try to make sure that that didn't reoccur. And one of the things that we noticed was that we weren't getting information, we weren't getting programs instituted and implemented in high poverty areas. And part of the reason for that is because sometimes those areas don't have the sophistication, the technical assistance that would allow them to basically compete successfully for competitive grant programs. So that was the genesis and reason for putting Strikeforce together. Now, there were obviously some issues concerning the implementation early in the process of Strikeforce, but we have essentially significantly changed that program, so now it is an integrated effort between NRCS, FSA, RD, and our nutrition programs, going down into a county area like the one you mentioned, and asking the question, what can we do, what do you need? And then trying to figure out collaboratively in a way to make sure that it happens. To date, we're now in 21 states, over 800 counties, 880 counties, I believe. We have 1,000 partners that are local partners that are helping to drive this effort, and as a result, we've invested nearly $16 billion in 129,000 different projects. It could be a home loan, it could be a business loan, it could be a conservation project, it could be a nutrition effort. What we were talking about there was to try to figure out ways in which we could use the agricultural base in a more creative and more value-added way in that county as part of an effort to try to address child poverty. because you're not going to be able to address child poverty unless you got decent jobs. You're not going to have decent jobs unless you use your natural resources in the most effective way. So part of what we're trying to do is to try to figure out how to do that, and we have a great partner in Florida A&M. We've given them a substantial amount of land that could potentially be used in a beginning farmer effort, and you could link that beginning farmer effort and the specialty crop production that could occur on that land with a Walmart, with and frankly, that's what's happened in Georgia. We have 80 African-American farmers who are selling collard greens to Walmart in Georgia that have now developed a successful co-op. That's the kind of thing that we'd like to be able to do more of. But it takes time, and it takes commitment and focused effort.
Well, I think you'll find the people in Gadsden County are ready to work hand in hand with you, and anything you can do, anything my team can do to help in this partnership, we stand ready to do.
Well, and we've taken the additional step of asking other federal agencies to work with us, and that's why the President developed the Child Poverty Initiative in which we will be looking at a variety of factors involving child poverty, and we will be selecting 20 areas within the country to sort of focus on a two-generation approach to child poverty, not just programs for kids, not just programs for mom and dad, but programs that will work for the family collaboratively and in concert and in an integrated way. We think that there's an opportunity there to maybe make a dent in the child poverty rate in rural areas, which is unfortunately too high.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, and again, look forward to working hand in hand with the Department of Agriculture in this project, and thank you for your commitment to helping work on child poverty. It is certainly a significant issue, not only in Gaston County, but across our district and our country, so really appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The lady yields back. Mr. Yoho for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vilsack, good seeing you again.
Nice to see you.
I want to go back to the Midas issue. Was that, when that first started, I saw was initiated under President Bush, and then in 2009 is kind of when it came together. When that was bid out, was that a competitive bid on that IT program?
You know, I don't want to mislead you. I'm not sure. I would be surprised if that weren't a competitive bid, but I can check on that.
Well, I only asked that because when I looked at the strike force, the language in here says that it looked like those were given out without a competitive bid. And so that raised the question on Midas. And then when I read through this, it just talks about the inefficiencies in the oversight of the FSA office watching this, and it says FSA has obligated over $444 million on the project as of 2015, but it has not modernized the farm programs, and we heard that you only have 2 applications working. Is that program even worth continuing, or is that something that needs to be ended and not put good money on top of bad and go to something else?
Well, what we did, first of all, I'm not going to suggest that this was done in an effective way, because obviously it wasn't. But I think it started off with a very grand vision and a implementation plan that didn't understand and appreciate how difficult it was going to be to overlay all of this on top of a 1980 system. There was this disconnect between the folks in Kansas City who do a lot of our IT stuff and the folks in DC who do a lot of our IT stuff. They weren't communicating particularly effectively, and we didn't have enough oversight. All that has been changed. That has been fundamentally changed.
For the future, I hope it is, because if it was a 1980 system that they started with, and it was 2009 when things were starting to be implemented, you would have thought they would have been projecting ahead on the new technology that's going to come out.
That relates to the fact that there are 2,100 offices and people in those offices that are pretty comfortable with one system, and none of that was really particularly well thought out. So what I did once I became fully aware of the problems, I said, we're going to stop Midas. We're going to start looking at this thing incrementally. So we did the first effort, which was to make sure that folks could access their records regardless of where they were. That's a big convenience opportunity and a tremendous savings of staff. That's implemented. Then the business integrity stuff to reduce errors. Now we're working on the questions that have been posed, working collaboratively with NRCS to allow producers to work from their homes. That process is in play, and hopefully over the course of the next months or so that we'll see progress on that. So there is work being done. So I don't think we want to say, you know, we should stop the program. Well, we don't want to stop the program. We want to make it more convenient.
Well, we're saying here that it's only effective or useful lifespan of 2021, I think. And I've got two other questions, so I'm going to move on. And it said that the FSA continued to pay the contractor as of April 2015, $213 million in taxpayers' dollars were obligated. And the OIG reported that during the time frame of questionable performance, FSA paid the contractor over $108 million. I mean, isn't there a way to stop that? If you've got an inefficient contractor, one that's inept, is there a way that you can stop a program in the future? And then I've got something I have to ask you about citrus.
The answer is yes, and that's why we're, on the accuracy effort, we are looking at a more intensive process to determine whether or not contractors who've worked on this in the past should continue, or whether we should bring new people in, and of course, that's caused some interest and concern.
Well, I'd like to work with you on that. And then just talking about the citrus in Florida, as you know, the citrus screening, and I appreciate the help you've given us. You know, Florida, we had a high of over 300 million boxes of oranges that accounted for $4.5 billion in revenue, and we've seen that drop steadily and rapidly due specifically to citrus screening. Is there anything that is being held up in that program or that needs to be expedited so that we just talked with our ag commissioner yesterday. In Florida, we've gone from 300 million boxes, then it went down to 200. This year's crop looks like it's going to be under 100 million boxes, and it's at a point where it won't sustain the infrastructure for that whole industry, and you're looking at millions of jobs that will be lost. What's your comments in 14 seconds?
Well, the challenge obviously is to find a solution. And that's why it was important to continue to put research money behind that solution. And that's exactly what the Congress did in the Farm Bill in providing additional resources directed to citrus screening research. That's precisely what we're doing, getting that money out the door as quickly as possible and in the hands of folks who are doing the research. There's some promising research on vectors. There's some promising research on heat therapy. There's some promising research on phosphorus utilization that we think potentially could, over the long haul, solve this, but that's basically where the focus is on essentially containing it to the extent we can and trying to figure out through research how to solve it.
I appreciate your efforts, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting him go over. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Scott, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. First of all, Mr. Secretary, it was great being with you in Georgia back in March when you came, and we had a wonderful time. Mr. Secretary, my state of Georgia produces more poultry than any other state in the United States. On an average day, the Georgia poultry industry produces 29 million pounds of chicken, 6.3 million pounds of eggs, and 5.5 million pounds of hatching age. And so you can see we have a very profound economic and business agriculture impact with our poultry. And I wanted to ask you, with the migratory season coming and birds coming south, can you tell us exactly what your department is doing to help thwart this avian bird flu and getting down into the south?
Congressman, we're taking a number of steps. Let me start with something that Congressman Peterson has been involved in and helpful with, and that is the development of a vaccine that could potentially be of assistance. We're making progress. We have a seed strain that appears to be fairly successful with reference to chickens. It's now in the process of being tested for turkey. Once those tests are completed, it will go to the company that basically is capable of producing the vaccine, and they in turn will work with other companies that are working on vaccines to begin the process of developing commercially. We have requested resources to be able to allow for stockpiling, which I know Congressman Peterson's interested in us doing. So that's first and foremost one thing we're doing to try to focus. The second thing we're doing is, if we are able to obtain a vaccine that's 100% effective, we want to work with our trading partners so that we don't discourage trade as a result of the utilization of vaccine in very targeted ways.
Well, let me ask you, what is being done specifically to help the growers? I'm particularly...
The vaccine is, one thing is vaccine. The second thing is to focus on biosecurity provisions that would allow them to tighten up their operations so that they could reduce the risk of this occurring. There's not a lot you can do about changing the flight of birds in terms of the migratory patterns.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Secretary, what about funding? What about helping with funding on this? There are certain funds that the APHIS is responsible for. I want to know, are any of these funds going to help the growers on the ground?
Yes. We have already committed well over $500 million for assistance to growers in two primary categories. One, indemnifying for loss, and two, helping to pay for the reasonable expenses of cleanup and disinfection. We are also working closely with the industry to try to create as tight a biosecurity set of protocols as possible so that we do the best job we can to mitigate the consequences and spread of this if it occurs again.
And so you're saying there are funds that can be directed to help the growers on the ground?
And they actually have been.
That.
They actually have been. We've actually
Good.
gotten resources out to farmers.
All right. The other thing is I want to compliment you working with my alma mater, Florida A&M University, for that tremendous, that land in Florida, I think, will be the largest acquirement of land to help beginning farmers for any of the colleges. And I just want to thank you for that. And while I'm on the subject of the 1890s, Mr. Secretary, your Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Mr. Joe Leonard, joined with many of us in the concern for getting more African American students going into the business of agriculture and agriculture business. And we are very, very, very much on board with that. I want you to also tell him how much we appreciate him providing that leadership to help us to get funds to be able to help these students to be able to go into careers in agribusiness. And one of the things we hope we're able to do is be able to tweak language in the Farm Bill that will allow these 1890s to be able to add the area of student scholarships and loan forgiveness, much as we did for our veterinarians. As you remember, we sponsored legislation, got that passed, we saw a shortage of veterinarians, and we actually did and helped them with loan forgiveness. So I wanted to make you aware of that, and certainly ask for your support and help as we move forward on that initiative to help the African-American students as well. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, 5 seconds. Congressman, there are 550 scholars currently working at USDA from these 1890 universities that are getting scholarship help and assistance and the commitment of a job at USDA. So we're going to continue to work to make sure that bright young people have opportunities at USDA as well as agribusiness.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentleman's time expired. Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. First, just going back to the Midas, I thank you first for your vigilance once you found out there was something going wrong and the money was being appropriated, for jumping on that and taking immediate action. However, to me, as a former prosecutor, there's no greater crime than the violation of the public trust and just basically corruption. And so I thank you, but I'm very disappointed that our justice system did not either civilly or criminally punish someone for abusing that much of the public's money. What policies and procedures have you taken now to ensure that we don't take as long to discover fraud and abuse by your department? Have you done anything, and what steps have you taken to ensure that we get to that a little quicker?
Well, One thing we've done with reference to the strike force and OAO is to basically take a look at the recommendations that OIG has recommended, and basically we're following through on each one of those recommendations. We have a completely different system for competitive review and competitive grants in terms of the 2501 grants that we're concerned. There are actually two sets of eyes that look on this. There's a panel that's not connected to USDA specifically that reviews the applications. There is also a second panel that reviews the mathematical computations for determination of competitiveness. And so that process is much, much better than it was. In terms of Midas, we have fundamentally changed the way in which we deal with IT. One of the problems we confronted when I became secretary is that each mission area of USDA had its own CIO operating relatively independently of one another. That has changed. We now have a process in which everyone is sort of working in a collaborative and integrated way, so we kind of know what the right hand is always doing in the left hand. We have also created an e-board that basically reviews projects, that requires updates, and is willing and able to ask the difficult questions. We have solved the issue to a certain extent of the different vision between Kansas City and DC, and we have put a project manager in charge of each of these major projects so that I know that there is someone personally responsible for oversight, and those people are meeting with me on a regular basis. I have monthly meetings on Midas. I have monthly meetings on ARC, accuracy, and I'm going to continue to have those meetings. And I have monthly meetings on our efforts at Blueprint, which is designed to create savings within and more efficient government. So there's a lot going on in that space that didn't go on in 2009 and 2010.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. On the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, how are you working with states to ensure or to bolster our anti-fraud efforts? Because I understand both you and the states have a process to work, so how are we working with states to bolster that process?
Two different responses to that, Congressman. First of all, the fraud rate in SNAP is a little bit over 1%. It's historically at low rates, significantly lower than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Two reasons. One, we are working more collaboratively with states. We are providing states with better training. We're data mining information. There are 7 million transactions in SNAP a day. We are using computer technology to sort of identify where there may be potential problems. For example, we saw a problem with lost cards, people coming in every other month saying, I lost my card, I lost my card. We now have a process that we piloted in North Carolina that was very successful, basically advising folks when they've had multiple cards lost that, hey, this is a problem and you may be violating the law. We've seen a significant decrease in the number of we did over 700,000 investigations and interviews on a personal basis. Over 40,000 people were disqualified from SNAP as a result of those investigations. And we are constantly looking at the 260,000 businesses that are SNAP eligible. And about 1,400 of those were basically stopped from doing business because they were involved in activities that they shouldn't be involved in. So there's an ongoing effort. We obviously still have work to do. We have teams that are now in place, additional staff dedicated to this. We're going to continue to work on it, but when you're dealing with as many transactions and as many people, there's still work to be done.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you. Ms. Lujan Grisham, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share the sentiments of my colleagues. It's nice to have you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you also for participating in program review and program support and visiting my home state of New Mexico. I actually have a similar line of questioning, and I appreciate that you spent so much time with my colleagues, Kelly and Yoho, on figuring out what is the balance. You don't want to throw out a program, the outreach programs and the Strike Force Initiative and Beginning Ranchers and Farmers. These are the kinds of initiatives that in a state like New Mexico are not only incredibly meaningful if they're implemented correctly, and we don't have waste or abuse in those programs, but are critical. We have the average age of our farmers now is 60 and over, and I appreciate that you've had another internal review looking at discriminatory practices and really looking at making sure that you move the department forward in being clear about your relationship with these communities, and I'm grateful for that. I think there's a lot of work to be done in those programs. So being forward-thinking and proactive so that it's not a hotline tip, that we're thinking maybe about random reviews of certain programs, and even in doing that so that it's not particularly focused on waste and abuse, because the intent isn't to try to find programs that don't work, although we want that information. We want accountability. We want staff to be held accountable every time there is a purposeful or there's conduct that creates accountability issues in taxpayer-funded programs. But in addition, and as is important, is making sure, I think, that these programs work in the way that they're designed to, and if they're not, to readdress that so that they can, because those initiatives, both coming from the department as identified strategies and methods that will make a difference for future farmers and growing food for this country, but also responding to ideas that come from our constituents directly in this committee. Is there anything we've missed in this dialogue that helps you have a relationship, particularly with this committee, but everyone, to really address both the accountability, so we're holding folks accountable, including in the private sector, and thinking about those clawbacks and making sure that they're not involved in these and mismanaging these programs, and also doing everything we can to highlight that USDA is leading the federal example for best practices and making these programs work for their intended beneficiaries?
Well, a couple of things. I think we're in a much different place than we were in 2008 when OAO was created. We have a receipt for service system now in place so people can actually prove that they went into an office. If they didn't get help, they don't have a problem, as they did in the past, of saying, we don't remember him coming in. Well, he has a receipt for service or a receipt for request for service. We also put minority members on county boards and county committees, which I think has helped, and we've seen the election of a lot of those minority members occur after their selection, so that's a good thing. The strike force, I think, is in a much better place and much more effective. I would say the one thing that you could potentially look at is something that the chairman raised in his question, or my answer, and that is, at what level will you require before action can be taken? In other words, is that standard of a criminal judgment and a civil judgment, is that the proper standard or the proper bar that has to be crossed before you can take action? I don't know. I think that's something that you all may want to talk about. It may be that that's a bright enough line that makes it easy for people to know when to and when not to hold people accountable, but it makes it pretty hard, right, other than, removing somebody from office or asking them to leave the department, it makes it a little difficult if that's the bar. So that may be something you may want to look at.
Mr. Secretary, I appreciate that, and we've had these conversations about some of the differences between federal employment and federal contracting systems and other government systems, local level and state, and I inherited an agency in the 90s that, couldn't account for $1 million, which at the time was 10% of our total budget, and we dismissed almost half the workforce, and it was difficult in a civil service environment, but it was warranted, and it's, you need to have the flexibility to have a hard line when you need a hard line, and the opportunity to retool, redirect, and retrain employees who are working hard, sometimes when a program's not flexible enough to meet the needs of its constituents. So I applaud the chairman and look forward to more conversations of that nature to get it right.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Davis for 5 minutes.
Hi, Mr. Secretary. First off, I want to thank you again for coming in here. You've always been open and sometimes brutally honest with your answers. I appreciate your participation in this oversight hearing today. It's been great to work with you and many of your staff at the USDA on a wide variety of issues where we don't agree on every single issue. One thing that I found out about you personally and also the USDA is that you're willing to listen to all sides. So thank you for that. And it wouldn't be a hearing without you coming here without me bringing up the school nutrition program. I do just actually want to thank you. I want to thank the department for actually bringing about some flexibility I think we can do a little bit more. I look forward to working with you on that. Again, I'd like to invite you to come out to one of our schools and talk to some of the folks on the ground in Illinois about the program. Your folks have done that. They've done a great job, and I know we're working together to make it even better. But before I get into an oversight question, I do want to bring up one issue, not related to school nutrition, but the summer meal program. I visit as many summer meal sites as I can, and I know we have a concern with the lack of participation because of some transportation issues, both in rural areas that I serve and some of the smaller urban areas that I serve too, and then other urban areas that I don't serve. Can you give me any suggestions on how we might be able to increase participation in the summer meal program that you and I can work together to make happen?
Well, I would say two things in response, and I appreciate your acknowledgement of our team at FNS working with you through some of the difficult issues involving the school lunch program. Two things. One, the EPT program that we have in a pilot, we believe does effectively deal with the issue of transportation in remote areas, because it basically provides an alternative to a concrete specific site that a youngster has to go to. It gives that family a little more flexibility to get the food to basically provide summer meals. So an extension of that program might be in order. The second thing would be to work with us and to direct us to be a bit more flexible in terms of the actual physical site. Right now we have a fairly narrow view of where these kids need to congregate. And I have been encouraging our team to look at creative ways to be more flexible, and so that instead of forcing kids to come to us, we figure out where the kids are to begin with and provide mobile opportunities. And some of that has happened, but we probably could do more.
Well, anything I can do to be helpful in offering suggestions for that flexibility based upon my visits in my district, I'm happy to help, and I appreciate your willingness to do so, sir. I do want to ask you one quick oversight question. My colleague, Mr. Yoho, alluded to some IT issues in the past. I just want to know, what has the USDA done what steps have you taken to implement some IT solutions to correct some of the problems that have been discussed here today? And what have you learned maybe in best practices from the private sector? And is there any issues that you see on the horizon that we might be able to assist with?
Well, when I came into this department, I asked to send an email to the employees to introduce myself. And I was told that I couldn't do that. And I thought, well, no, that can't be. Clearly I could send an email to an employee. They said, well, sir, you can send an email, but you can't send a single email. You have to do 17 separate emails. I said, what do you mean 17 separate emails? Well, we have 17 separate email systems. Well, we can go into a long, detailed conversation about how many problems there are with that model, but we've spent a considerable period of time, and we now have a single email system, which obviously provides greater security and allows us to save money at the same time. So one thing we've learned from the private sector is an effort to try to strategically source our technology. Again, I mentioned the fact that we had silos, we had individual CIOs. Well, they were off buying different systems and different hardware and different software that weren't necessarily compatible. We now have a strategic sourcing initiative where basically, before you do something, you better find out who else in your mission area is doing the same thing, and maybe you can purchase in bulk. And by the way, before you even do that, how about checking with other mission areas to determine whether or not they're buying the same thing at the same time, in which case you could save substantial money. So there's a focus on that, and there's a focus on consistency, and we've spent a good deal of time recently, obviously, in terms of cyber issues, reviewing our systems, identifying and creating authentication systems that are much, much tighter than they were 6 months ago.
Thank you. My time's expired.
John yields back. Ms. Plaskett for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, for this hearing. I think is very timely and much needed, and I appreciate so much the Secretary's having not just being forthcoming, but really having a depth of information that he's able to provide the committee with. Mr. Secretary, there's been quite a bit of discussion about the Office of Advocacy and Outreach, created in part to avoid the wholesale entire classes of rural development not being able to receive services. But I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about, and if you had information, as to the penetration of minority farmers in the growth of agricultural exports. I know that under your leadership, the agency has really grown tremendously the amount of exports that our farmers have been able to be a part of in being able to send their goods off outside of the United States. And I didn't know if there had been any data correlated, compiled, or any information that lets us know how much of that is really being able to go to businesses that are owned by minorities and minority farmers.
As you were asking the question, Congresswoman, it occurred to me that most of the activity and the progress that we've made with minority producers recently has been in the local and regional market, in other words, within the U.S., creating co-ops and doing business with local restaurants and local grocery stores and so forth. You ask a very interesting question. I don't have the answer specifically. We do have a breakdown of the number of small businesses that we do business with, the minority-owned businesses that we generally do business with at USDA, but I don't know that we necessarily have a breakdown of how frequently African-American producers, for example, would benefit from an export. I would say, my guess is that there's not a great deal for the following reasons. One, most of our exports are bulk, a substantial amount of them are bulk commodities, which play to the strengths of large-scale ag producers. Number two, if there is an opportunity, it may be in the organic space. I think a lot of the minority producers are getting in this space with the equivalency agreements we've been able to negotiate recently with Europe, Japan, Korea, Mexico, Canada. There's now new opportunities potentially for exports that might be a little bit easier to participate in and a little bit easier. We have been working with the Commerce Department to try to create a streamlined process for companies to export. You know, there's so few companies in this country actually export. You know, it's less than 5% of the overall companies, and most of them only export to one country. So we're trying to figure out ways in which we can help small businesses get in the export game more effectively. So I'm happy to go back to our team and ask specifically your question, but my sense is that you're probably not going to be.
I know that in the Virgin Islands, the issue of organic as well as the fancy foods is an area that our farmers would be most interested in. The types of products that we would produce that would be outside of our local markets would be in the fancy foods, the tamarinds, the guavas, mangoes, and those types of products. But the one thing that you mentioned that was really important as well in our area is when you talk about local and regional marketing and local and regional produce, because I find that one of the things that I hear quite frequently from our local farmers is not having the resources to assist them with processing, having cooperatives but not being able to do the value added to those products. What resources and have you seen being sent out to those areas in that respect?
Two programs come to mind, maybe three programs come to mind. The Value Added Producer Grant Program, the Local and Regional Food Promotion Program, and to a certain extent the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program, which is administered through the states and territories, are three areas where you could potentially get resources. What we'll do, Congresswoman, is I'll have my team get in touch with you and would encourage you to do what a number of folks have done recently, which is to come down, have your team come down to USDA. We put together a half-day kind of presentation of all the programs. I think you'll be quite surprised how many opportunities there are that you may not be aware of, and we'd be happy to do that.
And I would be remiss to not mention, of course, that we would very much appreciate you and your staff and others coming down to the territory. One of the things that you talked about is something that's very dear to us, which is your child poverty initiative. Presently, there are about 31% of the children in the Virgin Islands live in poverty. And so we're very interested in our farmers as well as our local government on how do we have our farmers be able to participate in feeding those children through the school lunch program, as my colleague discussed, and other areas to be able to serve those children.
Thank you.
Julie's time has expired.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Allen, 5 minutes.
All right, good, there we go. Well, this is, I just came from a markup, Mr. Chairman, so my mind is not all there. But anyway, we're back. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here this morning. And a lot going on here today. But just wanted to ask a couple of questions on the OAO Strike Force pilot program. USDA officials awarded the cooperative agreements non-competitively, and they awarded them to unqualified community organizations handpicked by political appointee Pearlie S. Reed. According to the IG, some of these community organizations were created just months before the award was made. These organizations allowed approximately $300,000 to expire or be wasted. The OIG recommended recovering that sum. Can you tell me what the status of that recommendation is?
Yes, $233,000 has been recovered. We're currently in the process of establishing proof to the, there's an issue involving $67,000. We believe that still is owed. The entity that we're dealing with believes they've already paid it, so we're in the process of trying to convince them that they still owe us $67,000, but $233,000 has been recovered.
Okay, sir. Another question is in the district, and of course, our folks are worried about the avian flu. Of course, we haven't had that problem down south yet in Georgia, but they are concerned with the migration of wild birds to the south over the winter. Anything we're doing to try to stop that?
Well, I think there are two things that can be done. One is to develop a vaccine and make sure that if we are able to develop an effective vaccine, that our trading partners don't hold it against us for using it. That's still an open question, and we've been working with a number of countries today to get them convinced to do this on to ban regionally as opposed to the entire country. And two, working with the industry to identify additional biosecurity initiatives and steps that could potentially be taken to mitigate the risk of spread of this. And then three, I suppose, is to continue to focus on the most efficient way of dealing with it if it does hit, in terms of disposal, in terms of depopulation, so that we minimize the risk that can occur if we don't do that properly or in a timely way.
Where are we with the development of a vaccine?
There's a seed strain that's been developed that's 100% effective on chickens. It's now in the process of being tested by our ARS folks on turkeys. Cross your fingers, hope it is 100% effective for them. Once that occurs, it will be, the seed strain will be provided to the virus company that has basically the license agreement. They in turn will then begin the process of manufacturing and working with other vaccine companies that would want to purchase the license to be able to produce it. We have asked OMB for additional resources to make sure, I think it's OMB, right? Or, yeah, OMB, to make sure that we have a sufficient resource to begin stockpiling that vaccine. We're also working with, as I said earlier, our foreign friends. We had a meeting in Baltimore where over 30 countries came with representatives to talk to them about the appropriate way of banning poultry if we have this, that it's not fair to your poultry producers because there's an incident in Oregon or Iowa to ban production from you. And so we're continuing to work on that as well. The last thing we're trying to do is to convince Congress to, this is a long-term issue, because I'm pretty sure this isn't the only time we're ever going to have to deal with something like this, is to see if we could complete the funding for the poultry lab improvements that I think are absolutely necessary in modernization of that lab.
That'd be good. And would this virus be available fairly soon, or what's the timetable?
Well, I would hope that would be, but I don't want to speak for the company in terms of how quickly they can turn it around. But I'm pretty impressed with the fact that in a relatively short period of time, we've come a long way. The previous virus was 60% effective, which meant that if you treated 100 birds, 60 would be okay, but 40 wouldn't. Well, that's not good enough. You got to get it to 100% or very close to 100% for it to be effective.
I'm about out of time, so I won't get to ask this question, but I still am hearing a real problem with H2A as far as legal services and suing our vegetable growers and costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars on really frivolous lawsuits. So that needs to be addressed, and we need to come up with a solution, and I yield back the remainder of my time. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Secretary, earlier when you were answering to Trent Kelly's questions about the CIOs, you indicated that there were stovepipe CIOs in the various agencies in your department. And did I understand that you've hired a chief CIO now to oversee those agencies?
There's always been a chief CIO, but that chief CIO wasn't empowered, if you will, to have sufficient oversight and sufficient responsibility, in my view, to basically be able to know and to be able to channel all other CIOs from each mission area in the proper direction.
So do they now have to report to that one individual?
Yes, and there's now a process based on, I think, a directive that I signed some time ago that says, look, you're all in this together here. You're not going to be operating separate and distinctly from each other.
I'm glad to hear that. We had the exact same problem in the Department of Homeland Security, and it's a real mess if you don't empower one individual to have direct authority over those individuals, because they want to do their own thing.
And they do, and that creates a lot of problems.
Glad to hear it. Many people, including myself, believe that the EPA's Waters of the United States rule is expanding the EPA's jurisdiction beyond what they are statutorily authorized. If the EPA determines that there is a jurisdictional water in a producer's field, but the Natural Resources Conservation Service has not identified it as a wetland, how will that work? How do you reconcile that?
The correct answer is I don't know, and the hope would be that that doesn't occur. I think there's still an awful lot of work yet to be done in terms of this issue. I don't think we've resolved it. I think there's going to be a lot of litigation and concern about this. But my focus, and frankly what I've told our NRCS people, is we're in the business of trying to help farmers do whatever they have to do to comply with whatever the law or regulation might be. So that's why we're trying to figure out ways in which we can be better at what we do in NRCS, more efficient, more effective, more timely, to be able to use resources more effectively. That's why we're excited about the RCCP program, because we think it's a way of dealing with large watershed scale projects that could potentially make a big difference in terms of water quality. So that's our focus.
Let me ask you the alternative to that. What if USDA identifies wetlands that the Corps and EPA have not identified? What will that mean for the farmers and ranchers? Will these wetlands be Clean Water Act wetlands?
I don't know the answer to that question, Mr. Chairman, and I'd be happy to have our team try to respond to both of those questions. Those are technical questions, and frankly, I just don't know the answer.
Yeah, I fear that they're going to end up in litigation, and that's just so unfair to our farmers and ranchers.
I think that's a pretty safe bet today.
Thank you very much. That's all I have. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady whose name I can't see from here.
No problem. Ms. Custer from New Hampshire. Very nice to be here. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. I apologize for my delay, but your contemporary and colleague, Mr. McDonald, was at the Veterans Affairs Committee, and we had a very informative hearing there. I wanted to say, first off, thank you very much. I'm very excited in New Hampshire that we have growth in farming. I think one of the few states, 5% increase in new farmers, and typically small. A lot of emphasis on farm to table and buying local, and farmers markets really taking off in our region. I wanted to talk to you about the program of beginning farmers and ranchers, and an Inspector General report issued in May of 2015 about the generation of farmers that are retiring from the industry and how we can encourage, and I don't want to say young people, because sometimes it's young people, sometimes it's not so young people. It may be people seeking a second career. The quote was, despite considerable resources and effort provided by USDA agency, the department lacks sufficient performance goals, direction, coordination, and monitoring to ensure success that funds were being used effectively by farmers. And I just wanted to see if you could comment on that. How can we implement effective performance goals to ensure that taxpayer dollars are being well spent in this regard?
Well, I've asked the Deputy Secretary to lead this effort, and she is traveling around the country visiting with a number of organizations and groups of folks who are interested in getting into farming or folks who are encouraging folks to get into farming. You know, one of the issues that has cropped up that we have asked specifically the Beginning Farmer Advisory Group to look at is this issue of land tenure. Candidly, you mentioned the fact that there are going to be a lot of people retiring and leaving the farming business, and that's probably true. The question is what happens to the land? And the question then is, you know, whoever owns that land, what is their ultimate goal here, or their relative's ultimate goal? Is it to maximize return, or is it to create opportunity for the next generation, or is it a combination of both? And frankly, I've asked its task force to come with recommendations on this issue of land tenure. What can we do, should we do, ought we do at USDA with reference to our programs to ensure that there is that proper balance, so that it's not a focus simply on bottom line, but it's also a focus on next generation, number one. Number two, you all ask us to create a military liaison position, which we have done with Karis Gutter, who's a Marine, who works at FSA. Karis is actively pursuing efforts to try to get into military bases with information about farming opportunities, and basically providing opportunities for us to actually go on base to talk to folks who may be retiring or thinking about retiring about the opportunities that exist in farming. I think it's also helpful, the recent effort by the Farmer Rancher Alliance, which is predominantly production agriculture, to create a more positive image about farming and a more supportive image, to push back a little bit on some of the folks who are constantly critical of farmers. And I have seen recently some very, very positive, good ads. I saw one yesterday from the corn growers that was fabulous about the opportunities in farming. And I think the more we focus on the positive aspect of farming, the more we focus on all kinds of diversity within farming and diversity of size of operations, methods of production, crops being produced, and people, the better it's going to be in terms of our ability to attract more younger people, or more folks into this business. We're seeing an uptick in beginning farmers. We still have more to do.
Well, and I appreciate you bringing up the military, and I would encourage you as well with veterans. I know our Veterans Administration in White River Junction, Vermont, on the border with New Hampshire, has a program for veterans in farming because of the connection to working with their hands, working outdoors. There's good mental health aspects to farming that are very conducive to a better transition back into civilian life. I also wanted to commend your deputy for coming to New Hampshire to have an event with women farmers, and I really appreciate that. I think that's something that we need to look into.
Huge job.
And I look forward to working with you on all of these programs to bring in different constituencies to farming.
You know, if I can, Mr. Chairman, the issue of veterans is one that I care very deeply about. It's obviously personal to me because of a nephew who served in Afghanistan, who's now potentially, hopefully, thinking about a career after he graduates from college in a Forest Service. These folks are good problem solvers. One of the challenges that we've seen at USDA, and I've asked actually Secretary McDonald about this, is we're trying to get more veterans to actually work at USDA, and we're trying to get more veterans to work in federal government generally. We've had some success, we've seen increased numbers, but the attrition rate, folks coming and then leaving, is disproportionately high. And so we're asking our team to look at this. Why is that? What aren't we doing, or what do we need to do to make sure that these folks are acclimated and get back into a system? The Forest Service is nice because it's got a sort of more of a military mindset, but the other mission areas, I think, we need to continue to do a little more work so that we make it a welcoming place for veterans, and that in turn should increase the more people getting into the business of farming from veterans.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ladies, time has expired. Mr. King, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you mentioned a vaccine that's 100% effective for AI, and I'm wondering if that might be in reference to a company out of Iowa?
It's not. It's a different company. It's actually the seed strain actually, Congressman, has been done by, I believe, by our researchers in concert with another company, but there's nothing to prevent Harris vaccine from participating in this once we get it figured out.
And I'm hopeful there will be an open competition to that, and we can bring all the technology to the table, and I appreciate your words on that.
The key here, I think, is for whatever entity gets to it first, being willing to provide the licensing arrangements and we will absolutely facilitate that, because no one company, this is my belief, I don't know if this is right or not, but no one company is going to be able to produce as much as we need, as quickly as we need it. Hopefully, we'll be able to get a lot of folks working collaboratively together. We stockpile enough so that if this thing does hit and hits us hard, we're in a position to respond quickly.
There's much to be said about vaccine, and I appreciate your comments on this. Also, you referenced phosphorus, which caught my interest in the discussion with Mr. Yoho. And I happen to have gone to watch a demonstration project in Storm Lake, Iowa, right before the 4th of July. That was taking out, by that demonstration, more than 99% of the soluble phosphorus that was suspended in the effluent that was at the discharge of the plant. And I just wanted to bring that to your attention, that there's new technology that's emerging here that looks like it could effectively solve the phosphorus problem that we have. And so this opportunity, I mentioned that, and I didn't know if that was something that you were aware of.
I wasn't aware of that. What I was referring to was the use of phosphorus at the base of a tree that's been hit by this citrus greening. It somehow has an impact on minimizing the consequences of citrus greening.
I will get that information to you and ask you to pass that along to your people that will want to be focused on it. And then another piece of this, there's so much to be said about bird flu, and I wanted to make sure that the committee is aware and the public's aware of how big this is. I'll say I know of no livestock disease problem that has ever in the history of this country that's met the magnitude of this avian influenza that we have. And I'm open to any rebuttal to that. However, into that, we're looking at nationwide 48 million birds that have been affected by this, all dead. 75% of the layers in the country, Iowa. 92% of the layers in Iowa in the 4th Congressional District. That's my district. And so this is devastating to a very localized region in the country. And it began in the Turkey region in Minnesota as far as the Midwestern component of this is concerned. And I know that USDA deployed people up there quickly. By time it hit in Iowa, my numbers are about 47 turkey locations were positive before it spilled over into 2 turkey locations in Iowa. And then from there, it hit the large laying operation near Harris, Iowa, and Osceola County. That's when I think it became such a large epidemic that it was for a time out of control. And so I wanted to speak with you about the things that need to be prepared for another event that may happen. And the focus on the East Coast, I'm glad to see that here. I think it's very appropriate that they do that. But the resources that you've had, I think you testified here that they are at least adequate to this moment. And I'm happy to be supportive if you need more resources. I would want to bring to your attention some of the things like the emergency response component of this, the level of urgency that I thought I should have seen, more in line with a flood or a natural disaster, a hurricane, perhaps tornadoes in too small a magnitude for this. I thought that level of urgency should have been higher. The chain of command, so that we know what that order of command is and who we can communicate with, I'd ask you to take a look at that. Maybe look at the Corps of Engineers approach on how they bring a lot of resources to play under a military-style chain of command so there can be a quicker response. You mentioned the disposal of this. That is a big problem. It was the biggest problem from the beginning. I'm very troubled by what we had to do. And some of that is composting birds outside in windrows, yes, mixed with compost material, yes, an attempt to cover them with sawdust or corn stover, but still exposed to birds that can carry that disease elsewhere. There are a number of, the epidemiological study that is at this point not completely complete is going to be, I think, a key to how we bring the biosecurity to bear, which might well be the key as to whether we can set up something maybe under RMA for an income interruption type of insurance for our producers, not only the turkey people, but especially the layers. So there are a lot of components of this that I would like to weigh in on, and I'll say this, that is it your counsel I should write a series of op-eds on this and have that talk, or is there a better method that we can convey some of these things so that the next disaster, if it hits, pray it doesn't, these things that I've been in a position to see also can be implemented for solutions?
Sure, can I respond? Well, I think the first step in the process, Congressman, would be for any ideas and thoughts you have to be willing to share them at the meeting that's going to take place next week in Iowa, which is designed to basically get people to discuss this openly and fully, number one. Number two, I agree with you in terms of the incident command process. That's why we are setting up a much different system. I agree with you that disposal is an issue, but of course, as you know, it's not just dictated by the federal folks. It's state folks are involved, and local folks are involved, and landfill people are involved. That's why I've instructed our team to begin thinking about where could this potentially happen in states that have not yet been hit. Where are the landfills? Can we begin having conversations with landfill operators now to acquaint them with what this is all about, why it's not a risk for them to participate in disposal? Disposal issues, absolutely, no question that's an issue, and that's why we're looking at ways in which we can do a better job of that. The EPI study is going to be supplemented, I think, by next week. We may learn additional steps in terms of biosecurity, and I think long-term, the issue of an insurance product or disaster program certainly makes a lot of sense. So there's an awful lot of work that's been done, going to be done. If you have input, more than happy to receive it beginning next week.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Jim's time expired. Mr. LaBaffa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Vilsack, and for being so available to this committee and faithfully coming as often as you do. It's appreciated. So, I just wanted to follow up on previous, what we've talked in the past about on California's drought situation and emergency relief funding that was made available, which was announced February of 2014. Intended for emergency assistance in the drought period. So actually it was in response to 2013 drought, and so we still have additional years on top of that. And we just need some more help with the state FSA offices on getting that out there, because we've had only a handful that have actually been issued of drought relief funds that have been processed. We have, and I have the email from one of the state staff here too that shows that there's still outstanding 180 applications of an initial $5.4 million that was approved in an account. There's at least $3.9 million still remaining in that same reserve that needs to be disbursed in response to the 2013. So we're here in 2015, and for those that really need that, it must be really having a lot of answers they're having to provide their bankers, et cetera. So could you help us with whatever it's going to take to expedite, at least in 2015, like ASAP, to get those additional, of those 180 applicants, get those out, and the remainder of those funds, get those dispersed, please.
Congressman, I appreciate you bringing this to our attention, and as a result of your efforts, we are prioritizing, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, Siskiyou County, because of your concerns. I would say that part of the challenge that we have is that it's not just our office. We work and have to work through the state of California's rules and regulations. There's a cultural resource review, there's an historic preservation officer and a tribal preservation officer that are involved in reviewing these projects, and it depends on...
even for something as simple as a disbursement of funds?
Yes, yes. And then...
It is California.
The producer has to basically submit their receipts, and then is essentially reimbursed for 75% of the work. So we will do what we can. We understand how important this is. That's why we allocated additional resources in 2014. That's why we just recently announced additional resources in 2015. We understand it's a problem.
All right. Can we work with you on finding ways to, where you've run into roadblocks, to be able to move those hurdles? There ought to be able to be waivers for things that don't have an effect on, I mean, this should not have any kind of a cultural effect or other things. There shouldn't be a reason to have this hold it up, and I'm not pointing at you, sir, just the other end of the process. If we can help us find that and, get to the specifics, maybe we can work to get a waiver process for something that really doesn't have any negative effect and doesn't need all that review. Is that reasonable?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. And just one follow-up on one of my colleagues' previous questions. You talked about the Waters of the United States ruling on EPA. Let's go to the other side of that. If USDA were to identify a wetland that the Corps or EPA or others had not necessarily identified, what would that mean for farmers and ranchers if USDA has classified it? Would that make those wetlands, if it was identified as USDA, a Clean Water Act wetland too, do you think?
Congressman, I apologize. I just don't have the information and knowledge to be able to answer your question accurately or adequately, but I have obviously been asked this question by you and variations of it by other members of the committee. I'm certainly happy to go back and ask our team to brief me on this and get me up to speed on precisely how best to answer
Well,
these
I
very
appreciate it,
technical
because
questions.
Waters of the United States is a bit of a moving target, I understand too, but, maybe if we can anticipate this, some of these things will not, go ahead, sir.
I agree with you that it's a moving target, and it may very well take the political process and a judge at some point in time to figure it out, but I apologize that I'm not able to answer your question.
That's okay. All right, so thank you, sir, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Jim yields back. Jim yields back. Mike Bosch, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And my questions are pretty short because, first off, let me apologize for being not present at the start. It was between you and the Secretary of the VA who got first. So, I'm sorry, but I'm here now. The question that I have, and it's because my district right now, sometimes you hear around this nation where people are lack of water, well, we'd like to send some to them. And I'm just kind of wondering, because I know our governor from the state of Illinois is applying for a disaster declaration. How are you prepared, and how does that process work for our farms that are just been devastated through the flooding that we're experiencing right through the Corn Belt?
Well, if the governor is asking for a secretarial designation, it comes through our process, and we try to respond to it as quickly as we can, because we know that then gives us the capacity to make emergency loans more readily available, those kinds of things. I'd be happy to take a look at it. I don't know if we've received it yet, but if we do, it's been my instruction to our team to try to turn these things around as quickly as possible. We did streamline the process for drought declarations, making it more automatic, but I'll be happy to take a look at it.
Okay, my staff has been working with them, so it's our hope that we can move fairly quickly, and because it is, the situation. Also, the other question I have is I know that you're talking about implementing the new information technology and that type of programs out there. Is any of that, would any of that reduce or shut down any of our service centers? Does it centralize it, or do we still have our service centers in the field, or is there any?
Well, it should reduce the amount of busy work and paperwork, and is already actually doing that in terms of reducing the amount of staff time. In the past, what would happen is if you came into an FSA office and you needed information, literally paper records would have to be pulled, and that obviously takes time. Now, that's no longer the situation. You can call it up on the screen pretty quickly. Over a longer period of time, as we continue this, you will eventually, if you have access to broadband and so forth, you'll eventually be able to access a lot of this information. Your conservation stuff's already accessible at home. So clearly that's going to reduce the amount of time that's been spent in the past on those kinds of issues. Now, what we've attempted to do is to try to plan for that by creating a process in which FSA offices will become more than what they have been in the past, without minimizing what they do, which is important in terms of their relationship with farmers. We'd like to see them also be a provider of information about other USDA programs that might assist the farmer that may not be an NRCS program or may not be a farm loan program, but they could be a marketing program. So we are in the process of creating pilots around the country to see whether or not FSA offices would be amenable to this, whether they could learn enough about our rural development programs to be able to say to a farmer coming in, hey, have you ever thought about this value-added opportunity, ever thought about this cooperative opportunity, as a way of creating additional responsibilities, additional information that will allow them to maintain their legitimacy and their relevance. There are issues relative to the structure that we have today. In my view, there are 31 offices today in FSA that have no full-time employee in them, but I cannot close those offices because Congress has directed me not to close any office. So when you basically say to me, operate it like a business, I say fine, then tell me that I can't close 31 offices that have no full-time people in them. You have to ask the question, is that really operating it like a business?
Thank you. I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Mr. Thompson, 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you so much. Mr. Secretary, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Wanted to touch base basically on the issue of the AD 1026s and the new conservation compliance requirements that we have in the Farm Bill. And we had the director of NRCS and the chief and had a conversation on that. So I wanted to follow up on that. You know, I have some continuing concerns. I know that actually the department and the agency has tried their best to reach out to inform folks about the need to file that form. But I do have concerns that, you know, the fall's going to come and the bill's going to come due, and there may be some farmers or ranchers kind of surprised because they missed it, whether it was livestock or perhaps specialty crops, some folks that this may be somewhat new to. And any idea of how many of those did or overall, how many did or did not complete the AD 1026 form in time?
The statistics that I can cite to you are 98.1% of producers that we thought potentially might think about this actually signed up and got their form on file. We estimate it's roughly 10,000 folks who potentially, from prior records, may be impacted, but of that number, many of them are no longer farming, some of them are no longer around. So that number is going to be significantly reduced by the time it's all said and done. You know, Congressman, we really made an effort. Every press release that went out about this 6 months in advance made reference to that June 1 date. We actually worked with the companies to make phone calls, to send emails. There was an aggressive, comprehensive effort, and I think that's why you saw as many people sign up. At the end of the day, there may very well be a handful of folks who just didn't get it done, but I think on balance, you know, we did the best we could with a very firm date that was set in law.
Do you have any flexibility at this point? And I'm glad to hear that, you know, that was the number I had heard too, 10,000, but, you know, as you said, some of those may not be farming today, may be choosing not to just go down that route in terms of crop insurance. I mean, I'm just curious, any tools that you may have as we get closer to that and we see that people start to discover that they're just not going to be in compliance, therefore their premiums are not going to get that subsidies, and therefore may take it out of the range of what's affordable in terms of managing their risk. Or I don't know if we've provided you with any flexibility to in the final hour.
Yeah, I've been told that we don't.
Okay.
We are sending out letters now to that handful of folks who may, as you say, be surprised when they find out. Those letters started going out July 22nd. I guess it's today. They go out today. So we will obviously begin hearing soon, I suspect, from folks. I've been told we don't have any flexibility. I'm happy to go back and ask that question one more time. But I don't think we have much of, that's why I was so insistent on a massive effort to make sure that everybody knew the June 1 date was coming up. I can't tell you how many interviews I gave about that, how many times I mentioned it. We did everything we could to try to get that information as personal as possible to people.
And I think you've done a good job. I think the department, quite frankly, NRCS has done a great job of pushing that information out, and so I look forward to keeping in contact with you just as we get closer to that date, just to see how we did in the end. So,
Fair enough.
Thank you. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time is, Chairman yields back. Mr. Abraham for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I represent Northeast Louisiana, Central Louisiana, and the problem that I've had come up is it goes back to how generic base acres or former cotton acreage are divided among farmers on a farm. For some reason, the FSA has decided to divide up generic base acres differently than how the agency divides up the regular base acres. And I know this is a problem throughout the South. The Chairman's great state of Texas is running into the same obstacle. And the division of the regular base acres, it makes perfect sense to me and my farmers, and I still farm actively too. It simply follows the rental agreement on the farm. But for generic base acres, instead of simply dividing up generic base in the same way, in accordance with the rental agreement, FSA ignores the rental agreement and instead divides the generic base upon the total planted acres of covered commodities on the farm as recorded in the FSA's 578 form. And I've looked at that and ran into this on my farm. So the issue gets confusion, but the upshot is that the FSA's new way of dividing up the generic base among producers on the farm results in a lot of inequities where farm bill payments are going to be paid to actually the wrong farmers. So some farmers will be seriously shortchanged, while other farmers will receive more than they should, actually windfalls in some cases in my district. So this is especially problematic because rental agreements and loans have been made based upon the way regular acres have been allocated. So again, I think the best way to resolve the problem just personally is to simply have the generic base divided like the regular base is divided. So I guess my question, will you work with me and my rice farmers especially that want to convert these old cotton-based generic acres into rice farms as we move forward and try to fix this problem? I need some help. We need some help in the South on that.
Congressman, I need some help myself. At one point in time, I could answer that question because it was in my head, but it's not in my head. Can I ask my...
Sure you can, and you can get back to me. I mean, whatever, I just, you know, I need to, I guess, ensure or tell my farmers that this is a fixable problem, because right now these base acres, these generic base acres, they're not being very allocated very productively from our rice farmers especially.
Congressman, I'll absolutely commit to you that our team will get in touch with your folks and work with your folks.
And that's all I ask.
I can't, I don't want to mislead you in terms of whether or not it's a solvable problem. It may or may not be. I just don't, right now I'm calling it up. I'm having a hard time calling it up.
As long as we can have a conversation, then I'm good.
Always.
All right, one other question, then I'll yield back. On the Inspector General's recommendation, it included having a third-party non-government entity review of the Midas program to determine whether it's the most effective IT fix or not. Where is the status of that recommendation from the Attorney General? The Inspector General. As far as you guys are concerned, are y'all taking that to heart? Are you utilizing it? What stage is it in?
We're attempting to follow all the recommendations that the OIG has provided on many of the subjects that we've talked about today, including Midas.
Do you actually think a third-party entity needs to come in light of the GAO and the Midas program problems?
Honestly, I'm not sure that would necessarily be helpful. It's certainly at the time that this was reviewed and the time that these problems occurred, and essentially that's what we did by bringing in somebody from the outside. I brought in Jonathan, who's now our CIO. I brought him in from the outside and said, take a look at this. He came back and he basically said, here are the problems that you have. You've got a disconnect between some of your career folks in Kansas City and some of your folks in DC. You have an old system that people are trying to cobble together, and you've actually, this has been a fairly aggressive effort. We need to break this down into incremental parts, and we need to do this in a more thoughtful way in terms of bringing this stuff online. And as a result of bringing him in from the outside, looking at this, he became the project manager. He became meeting with me on a weekly basis, and I think we have it in a much better place today. So in that sense, we did bring somebody in from the outside. Now, I don't know if it was an outside entity, but it's certainly somebody who knew what he was talking about, and I think he's got it in a much better space.
Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Jim yields back. Before we adjourn, I ask the ranking member any closing remarks he has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to just thank the Secretary again for his forthright answers today and doing a good job as he normally does, and also thank him and Dr. Clifford and others at the department for their response to the problems. We went through probably one of the toughest times that I've ever seen, with this avian influenza situation, and people were pretty down in the mouth at one point, but I met with a number of people on Saturday, and their attitude has changed, and part of that, I think, is because of your efforts and Dr. Clifford's and others in terms of listening and responding, and that has helped restore confidence, I think, in the industry as well. And in your response today to the questions, I think you hit on the things that my producers were concerned about, and what that means is that you've been listening, and, we don't have all the answers, any of us, but we are going to try to boil down out of the 100 different ideas out there about how to improve things, we're going to try to boil that down to a few, bring it to this meeting you're having next week, I think it's next week.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And again, just thank you for what you've done and what you're doing, and we look forward to continue to work with you and appreciate your...
Well, thank you, Congressman. The meeting's on Tuesday next week in Des Moines. So.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Chairman yields back. Mr. Secretary, I had one real quick follow-up on the debarment and suspension. Can you bring the civil suit, I guess, to someone, or does it have to be justice do that?
It's just that everything that we do in terms of a legal action gets,
okay.
It's justice.
Well, I appreciate your comments earlier about wanting to expand perhaps that issue about what is subject to debarment, because my crack legal staff showed me that there is under that regulation 180, whatever, that there are some steps beyond just civil and criminal things that can lead to allowing you to present somebody for debarment and suspension.
There are, however, as it relates to this issue, the situation we're talking about here, those don't necessarily apply. They're very specific. So there is a process, I think, where you could amplify on that list that would create more flexibility. And I think the idea, Mr. Chairman, is frankly is to create some kind of due process mechanism by which there is a determination that there was wrongdoing, so you don't get in a situation where I make a judgment about somebody and they come in and they go, well, that was a poor judgment, or you did it because you didn't like the guy.
You didn't like the guy, right? Now, yeah. Well, Mr. Secretary, I think you and I are violently in agreement with each other on what needs to be done with respect to that, so I appreciate that. Oversight's not all that pleasant from time to time. In many instances, these investigations take a long time to get done. Some of the things we're talking about are several years old. That doesn't lessen the impact it has on the American people's trust and confidence in all of us that Congress is doing its job, that you're doing the job you need to do to protect those scarce resources that all of us have. But I hope we can have your commitment to continue to work with us on all of these oversight issues. Your team has been working really well. I was hoping that we wouldn't make you so mad this morning that you decide to bail out on us on that deal, because we do have some legitimate things that we want to understand and know. And I know you've got certain equities, we've got equities, but having your team work with us is, I appreciate that, and we don't, devolve into some sort of a mud fight that's unnecessary, and I really appreciate what you guys have done to date. One other thing, there was another thing we talked about where in these grants are made to NGOs or other organizations, making sure that you've got the proper internal controls in place, that they then spend the money the way they're supposed to, and that they don't, overpay themselves, all those kind of good stuff. There's just a variety of ways that, not super material to the $177 billion that you guys oversee every year in expenditures. I mean, that's, out of your testimony, that's a pretty sizable number, and the number of transactions are pretty daunting, and we're only talking about a few of those, but those few, as I mentioned earlier, taint the water. So I appreciate you being here this morning. Under the rules of the committee, and we're getting you out here right on time, under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material, supplementary written responses from a witness to any questions posed by a member. This hearing on the Committee of Agriculture is adjourned. Thank you, Tom.